Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich. Take a look at the title of this composition, Music for 18 Musicians. Notice that no traditional musical ensemble is specified here. It's not a suite for orchestra or a string quartet or something like that. And notice that the title does not specify a purely instrumental ensemble or a purely vocal ensemble, but everything in it seems to be quite open. In fact, that's the very first thing you should take note of in this composition, its performing forces. Now this work requires the contributions of a diverse array of musicians. There are 4 singers, a cellist, a violinist, etc. The singers don't sing an actual text. They simply sing syllables, and they function more or less as instruments. And they add a certain timbre or tone color to the ensemble that could not be gained by normal instruments. Now, I'm not going to ask you to remember every single type of musician represented in this ensemble, but I think the beginning of the list, 4 singers, cellist, violinist, etc., is a reasonable thing. You should have no trouble recognizing it on the exam because no other work we've examined in this course uses quite this array of performers. Now the composer of this work has not specified its genre, and so one must use a bit of imagination to see exactly what this composition is. I would describe it as being a concert suite. That is a set of pieces intended for concert performance. Now, I haven't asked the composer himself about the genre of this composition. I doubt that he really cares very much about it at all. But we need to have a way to classify it so that you can remember this composition and so that you can distinguish it from others in this unit. So the designation concert suite, I think, serves well enough for this work. Basically, this very long work, it takes about an hour to perform in its entirety, comprises 14 movements. Well, basically 12 movements with an introduction and a postlude, I suppose. And they are carefully articulated. You can tell when one section begins and when one section ends and so on. The movements, however, are connected throughout. So you can't expect to have a period of silence between them. Symmetry is something that has always fascinated a musician. If you think back to our unit on Renaissance music, you may recall my presentation of the beginnings of the Mass cycle, or compositions that focused on the Mass ordinary. And one of the reasons that composers did this was not only the convenience of having pieces that they could use again and again for different Masses, but also because the kinds of text in those 5 prayers of the Mass form a certain symmetrical grouping. The first and the last of them were a specific kind of prayer. The second and the second to the last of them were another kind of prayer, and the one in the center was yet a third kind of prayer. In the overall construction of this work, we have the same sort of a thing. The introduction to it, or the prelude, is basically mirrored in the last section or in the postlude of it. And various sections within it have this kind of symmetry in them as well. You have a sense of going forward and then going backward. Now, when you hear this work, you're going to hear a work that really illustrates very clearly the principles of musical minimalism. Each one of the sections will start out with a musical idea. It will be repeated many times, and it will, in the process of being repeated, it will be varied in one way or another. Sometimes the musical idea will remain static or the same, while another musical idea joins it to create the kind of variety that you expect to find in these compositions. And as I may have mentioned earlier, I think that one of the appeals of this musical style is that the listener gets to know a certain musical idea, and he can then appreciate the variety or the transformation that it undergoes. Repetition and variation. That's what musical minimalism is all about, and that's what you can expect to hear in this composition. Also, as you listen to this composition, consider how far we have come in our exploration of Western music and where we have arrived finally in terms of musical styles. We seem to have come full circle. After a wild period of experimentation in the 20th century, a number of composers have decided to return to the principles of older musical styles. Indeed, in minimalist compositions you hear traditional tertian harmonies and rather conventional treatment of consonance and dissonance. You also notice that it uses as its primary principle of presentation something that was the hallmark of the classical style: repetition. And so this type of music seems very simple and very conventional.